These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. Today, things get bigger. The battles are going to get larger in scale, the enemies more significant, the borders are going to push further than ever before. But before we get too deep into it, we see that Assurnasirpal's waistline is expanding even faster than his empire is. In fact, looking at the latter section of his career, the idea has been put forward that our favorite psychopathic monarch wasn't actually a psycho at all, but was instead taken with the strategy of starting his reign as brutally as possible to allow him to settle back and sort of relax for the rest of his reign. His real passion, according to some, was not slaughter, but construction. And there is a hint of merit to this idea. He's already founded more cities than any other Assyrian king that we know of. This may be a function of him trumpeting his city building more than other kings, but whatever the underlying reality, he wouldn't be trumpeting it so loudly if he wasn't quite pleased with himself for his construction efforts. In some parts of his chronicles, it does almost seem like rebellions which pull him away from construction are annoyances, distracting him from his real passion. We've already seen him taking long breaks in the middle of otherwise frenetic conquests to play city builder, and we hear a great deal about Kala, especially in the sources. And of course, archaeologically, we have access to Tushha, Kala, Der Asher, and we haven't mentioned it yet, but he does quite a lot to the temple at the town of Imgur Enlil as well. It would be possible to write a biography of Assurnasirpal describing him as a dedicated builder, who did also undertake the sort of conquest expected of him, with a few scattered, war crimes blemishing an otherwise impressive record of construction. And this wouldn't be wrong or an intentionally distorted view. It would be an archaeologically focused approach, emphasizing the physical record and minimizing the written record. But to be honest, on this show, I typically overemphasize the written record at the expense of the physical remains, just because that's what I can more often access. By which I mean, when I go to check sources or investigate archaeological sites, the papers and documents are far, far more likely, in my experience, to be behind an academic institution paywall in the case of purely archaeological data, or sometimes just not at all available to the general public and obscure enough that websites, shall we say, dedicated to getting around the knowledge-destroying academic publishing system frequently don't have copies. Written sources, on the other hand, are, for whatever reason, far more often republished by the authors themselves in much more easily available forms, such as the online repositories dedicated to Akkadian and Sumerian literature, compiled in easily accessible anthologies, and when all else fails, written sources are more often republished on Academia EDU or Z-Library or Sci-Hub. And I won't go into too much of a rant about how terrible academic publishing is, but people do ask me how to get into history on your own, and they ask me for journal articles, and the truth is that these sometimes questionably legal open access methods often really are the only way for a normal person without a university affiliation to get deep into the actual practice of history without someone there to mediate for them. And thankfully, in recent years, I've been able to get access to the University of Texas library, since my university subscriptions ended 15 years ago. But the fact that so much of academic history is closed off, it's a bad thing. And it does mean that the wider world needs a popularizer, either an enthusiastic amateur like myself, or a scholar with a lot of free time like Trevor Bryce or Samuel Noah Kramer, or a huckster like Graham Hancock or Zacharias Sitchin. As for the general audience, for someone with no background knowledge and little training in understanding the data, it can be genuinely hard for them to tell the difference between someone like me and someone like Graham Hancock. I talk to just regular people, and they're like, what do you think about this Graham Hancock guy? He sounds like he's doing the same thing you're doing. And in a sense he is. He's bringing an interpretation of history. But because people have no direct access to the actual facts, they can't tell the difference between Graham Hancock and Trevor Bryce. And this is why journal articles, for which the author and the peer reviewers never actually get paid, only these massive corporations that have very little to do with the actual scholarship and often get in the way of the actual scholarship, all these journal articles need to be open access. And until they are, I'm going to continue to find open access routes to make this show and my studies possible, and I encourage you genuinely to do the same. There are books written by authors who write their own books. The Samuel Noah Kramer, Trevor Bryce, these are guys that wrote their own books. I buy those, since the author actually gets paid. But the vast majority of academic work is done by people whose salaries are paid by institutions and who derive no direct financial benefit from the sales of their papers. Even the institutions, they have to pay out the wazoo just to access these journals that their professors publish in. It's absolutely a mess. I don't know how that was relevant. That was unrelated to anything. But I do get questions about my methods sometimes, and I've been shy to tell people, oh yeah, I pirate these papers. But I've thought about it, and I'm really not ashamed of it. This is for the papers. If the writer of the thing is getting paid by the book or something, definitely support the people doing that work. But for these academic articles, that's not the case. That's not how it works. Assurnasirpal, however, he liked building stuff. And the crowning glory, as far as we can tell, of his reign was Kala. To celebrate the inauguration of his palace, and hence the start of Kala as the seat of Assyrian government, Assurnasirpal held what he considered to be the most spectacular party and feast ever celebrated in human history. 69,000 people, nice, were invited. 47,000 from the Assyrian heartland, so basically anyone of any standing from the empire, plus 16,000 people from Kalhu, which would have been a significant chunk of the city, almost certainly a majority at this early stage, as well as all 1,500 palace employees. We're all invited to this thing. Whether that palace employees means like the officials, or if it means the servants working at the party, or if it means like soldiers being invited to the party, that's unclear. Plus there were also 5,000 foreign dignitaries from all the places we've seen his armies venture, as well as from distant Anatolia and Phoenicia. Now, this last makes people wonder about when exactly this consecration festival happened. Some say that only people who have been conquered came to this party. Since folks came from so far away, therefore, it must have been very late in the reign after he's conquered way out into Anatolia and Phoenicia. Others say that he invited folks from well outside the Assyrian sphere at this point, since even in year 5, it's already very clear that Assyria is the largest nation, aside from Egypt, in the Near East. I would think, based on the written evidence, that this party was fairly early, either in Assurnasirpal's 5th year or soon after. But the exact year isn't super important here. Anyway, all these dignitaries were bathed and anointed and most of all fed. Assurnasirpal exhaustively lists all the foods that have filled the tables for the whole of what must have been a 10-day feast. 300 oxen, 1,000 calves, 16,000 sheep and lambs, 1,000 deer, 2,000 ducks of various sorts, 2,000 of various sorts of more exotic birds, 10,000 pigeons, 10,000 turtle doves, 10,000 small birds, 10,000 fish, 10,000 tiny desert mice, 10,000 loaves of bread, 10,000 jugs of beer, 10,000 skins of wine, 10,000 containers of grain, 1,000 boxes of vegetables, 300 containers of oil, 300 containers of malt, 100 containers of fine beer, 100 containers of fine grain, 100 containers of pomegranates, another 100 each of pistachios, onions, garlic, grapes, turnips, honey, ghee, mustard, milk, cheese, and beef jerky. For the more high-end stuff, only 10 homers each was provided, which is about 2,000 liters dry volume, for a variety of untranslatable nuts, spices, delicacies, and desserts. The readable ones include shelled pistachios, cumin, dates, olives, fine oil, and gourds. There were many other things that were included in his listing, but we don't have specific translations for a lot of the particular foods and spices on that list because they only show up on lists like these without any particular context. People wonder whether these large numbers given for the foods were estimates or exaggerations or literal counts. But given that the numbers of people participating were specified very precisely, 47,074 invited persons from Assyria, for example, it seems to me quite likely that the king at least attempted to get exactly 10,000 of each meat type and 10 homers of each spice, or whatever extremely impressive round number he was appropriate to target for each food. The numbers involved are massive, of course, but none are obviously insane for an incredibly wealthy and powerful empire dominating the entire region and led by an insane megalomaniac dictator. Anyway, assuming that this great feast occurred in the 5th or 6th year of Assurnasirpal's reign, it marks a turning point in his ambitions. It also, by the way, marks a change in how he writes about his reign. The hyper-detailed annals become a bit more confused for years 6 and 7, jumping more often between subjects, but after year 7 he no longer writes about his reign with the same specificity. What everyone can agree on is that the king no longer seems to feel the need to impress a wide literate audience with the details of his campaigning. The reasons for this are less clear. Perhaps he felt that he had established himself sufficiently and could now relax a bit and sort of coast along. Perhaps, however, he's continuing to campaign at the same intensity. Perhaps he simply loves both building and warfare and is living his best life each day, but he's simply writing about it differently. I would suggest the latter. Others have suggested the former, and there are good cases to be made for both. Whatever the case, though, Assurnasirpal is a man of ambitions who has now, following his great inauguration, largely concluded his great ambition of constructing Kalhu. Now, as a living city, work will never truly stop on the new capital, and there's probably still stuff like the ziggurat that's still got to keep on climbing up and up and up. But the exciting part of designing something new and raising it from the lone and level sands has now passed. His new ambition is to reach the Mediterranean Sea. Now, this isn't an arbitrary or a new idea, but this is the point at which the king sets his mind to the task. Ideologically, reaching the Western Sea has resonances with the now ancient tales of Sargon and Gilgamesh, both of whom have always been well known in Mesopotamia but are enjoying an increased prominence in the Neo-Assyrian period. Practically, much of the world still hasn't fully recovered from the Bronze Age collapse. The map still has far more territory controlled by nomads and statelets than by empires, and both Egypt and Babylon are in recession, generally speaking. Assyria is, of course, the great shining exception in the east, and the cities of coastal Canaan, called by the Greeks Phoenicians, are the only other exception here, which makes them a target. In political terms, the Phoenicians are, of course, fragmented statelets, but they're growing in every possible way now except territorially. The famous Phoenician colonization of the Mediterranean is by now well underway. The main economic engine for economic regrowth in the entire Mediterranean and the Near East as a whole is the Phoenician merchants. If you were to stand in Mesopotamia and look out on the rest of the world in 880, the thing worth taking more than anything else would be this wealth. Everyone else is wasteland by comparison. And this seems to be exactly Assurnasirpal's perspective at this point. Sitting in his new capital, it's likely that the gifts of the Canaanite dignitaries are far finer than the gifts of all other visitors. And while we have less sense of how he goes about pursuing this goal, all his actions at this point seem oriented towards reaching the Mediterranean and the vast wealth of Phoenicia. But he isn't wholly single-minded about it. He still has a good sense of the wider picture and all the things he could accomplish in the region aside from his main goal. Honestly, for all the flaying and burning of youths and other war crimes, he seems to be incredibly high-functioning, a man of vision and competence. And we see this as the 6th year kicks off. He celebrates the new year and the harvest, possibly with his massive inaugural festival in Kala. And at the start of summer, then he musters a modest-sized militia to bulk out his professional army and heads out on a tribute tour. The best place for a tribute tour at this point seems to be the Khabar region, and the king lists for us place after place that he visited, which readily gave up various levels of plunder. This expands the Assyrian treasury and deepens the sense of Assyrian control over the region, which is all good as far as the king is concerned, because he really needs to solidify his home base before he goes on an expedition to basically the edge of the universe. But our king isn't just focused on collecting. He's also implicitly growing the bounds of the kingdom simply by making it clear to everyone that he basically assumes that anywhere he travels is part of his empire. And this goes well for him as he travels down the Khabar River and then back along the Euphrates until he hits the fortress of Suru among the Suhu lands of the middle Euphrates River. We don't really know what all has been going on with Suhu. We don't have a full picture here. At one point they were rebelling against Assyria, at one point they were sending tribute without even being asked, and now it seems they've fallen under Babylonian sway. Are they independent but under a Babylonian sphere of influence? Are they Babylonian subjects? We don't really know here. You see, Babylon as a whole has been a black box for quite some time now. Last we heard, their king had been killed back in 887 during or soon after a war against Assyria. Their new king, Nabu-apla-iddina, built on his father's success in that war against Assyria, and Babylon is currently in a generation of ascendancy. Things are stable enough that the great scholars of Babylon are able to compile new editions of some major scholarly works, such as the great medical diagnostic manual Sakiku, and a great demonological catalog, and some suggest that the tale of Era and Isham is from this generation, though many dates for that have been proposed. It is a bit frustrating because, though it is nice to have this spot of light in the darkness around Babylon from a handful of surviving texts, both Assyrian mentions and actual contemporary Babylonian documents, it also seems that we're right at the cusp of a number of things starting and ending down in the south. For example, we will, after his 30-year reign, never again see Isin as a prominent political center. Soon after his reign, the Kassites are going to largely split off from Babylonia. You may remember that the Kassites were the kings of Babylon through most of the Late Bronze Age, but even after the Kassite dynasties were replaced, Kassite officers and Kassite tribes played a major role in governance and continued to be significant power centers. After this, however, Babylon appears to lose control over Kassite lands in the east for a while, and we won't see much of them in positions of power in Babylon ever again. Replacing them, however, is the Chaldeans, a Semitic group who appears basically out of nowhere. We do know basically their story. Somewhere in the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse, with groups migrating and knocking other groups out of their homelands the way billiard balls clack around a pool table, one of those groups got knocked from being a minor Semitic tribe in the Levant eastward until it's now the dominant military force in the land which was once known as Sumer. Already under Assurnasirpal and the Babylonian king Nabu-apla-iddina, this process is so far along that the region that was once called Sumer is now called Chaldea, which in the shared Akkadian of Assyria and Babylon would have been called Matkaldu or Matkashdu, meaning the land of the Kaldu or Kashdu people. We aren't totally sure what the Chaldeans called themselves, but given that the middle letter there is so often confused even among their neighbors, it is apparently, according to the linguists, quite likely that they had a letter in their phonology corresponding to the double L in Welsh, and they were probably called themselves the Kaldu. Not that I'm an expert on that particular sound either, if you couldn't notice. Anyway, their name is hard, so I'll be calling them Chaldeans, since I only like historical accuracy when it's easy to pronounce. That's a Latinization of a Hellenization of an Akkadianization of the original name, but you know that's fine. That biblical reference, Ur of the Chaldees, hometown of Abraham, by the way, only makes sense historically after 900 BCE at the earliest, since it's right around this time that the Chaldeans seem to have taken over the cities which were once Sumer. Anyway, under Nabu-apla-iddina, who is not Chaldean, he's some sort of Babylonian, his specific dynasty is unclear, but under Nabu-apla-iddina, Babylon seems to be reinforcing its control over the lands which were once Sumer and Akkad, but are now Chaldea and Karduniash. And this control now extends, in some sense, all the way up to the middle Euphrates River. And a ruler of Suhu came to Ashur not that many years ago, bearing tribute. Did the Suhu leader come to Ashur out of fear of a Babylonian takeover, which has now happened? Or did the Babylonians take over Suhu because they saw them getting closer to Ashur? Or was Suhu just a victim of two larger powers which just got crushed beneath the chariot wheels? The region is now Babylonian as the Assyrian army marches forward. Assurnasirpal sends a letter to the regional governor, announcing that the tribute tour is coming that way, reminding the governor that this land is an Assyrian tributary state, Babylonians notwithstanding, and informing him that he should be ready with tribute and submission when the king arrives. But the governor is, for whatever reason, no longer the governor who had once submitted to Ashur. It's now a Kassite named Kuduru, appointed by Nabu-apla-idna, and surrounded by a mix of Kassite, Babylonian, and native Suhu soldiers, numbering in the low thousands, garrisoning walls. And this new guy isn't terribly impressed by Assurnasirpal and his giant army. Oh, but he should have been. The army surrounds the fortress town, sparking a sally led by the Kassite troops. We have no idea what a Babylonian army would have looked like at this time. They did at least have a cavalry and a chariotry wing, though in what capacity they were operating is unclear, and seemed to have been a principally infantry force. The Kassite sally was repulsed and the city was stormed after only 2 days of preparation, and quite a lot was captured, including some important Babylonian officers, including a troop commander who was also famous as a diviner, apparently, like famous enough to get mentioned by name, as if everybody in all of Assyria would have heard of this guy. Assurnasirpal makes a very big deal about this victory. Taking this fort means he now has control over Suhu, the middle Euphrates region, where the river runs from modern-day Syria into modern-day Iraq. He tells us that this act, which could potentially have been seen as a declaration of war against Babylon, was in fact so impressive that the Babylonians were frozen in their tracks, deer in the headlights style, and so overwhelmed by Assyrian might that they simply chose not to contest the matter any further, allowing Assurnasirpal his victory. We're told that all of Babylonia very nearly fell to their knees in awe at the king's almost godlike majesty, and the emanating aura of awe spread all the way from Suhu to the eastern mountains, an illuminating radiance before which all were brought to submission. And then Assurnasirpal simply went home and finished the campaign for the year, which tells us that basically none of that was true. Sure, there does seem to have been a battle in Suhu and a victory to some extent, but it's pretty clear that if the victory had actually been that sweeping, the Assyrian army would have wintered in Babylon, not Kalhu, that year. It could be that further down the river sat more Babylonian forts and forces that would have been too risky or costly to assault. It could be that the Babylonian army was actually quite strong at the moment, but occupied on some other front, while Assurnasirpal is coming in and sniping at a less guarded flank. My own thought is that the siege battle, though victorious, was more costly than expected, which would explain both why the king felt the need to big up the victory so much, compensating for the very visible costs of a perhaps unexpectedly rough campaign, and why the army appears to have retired to Kalhu immediately afterwards, staying only long enough to erect a statue of the king with the inscription, Assurnasirpal, the king whose strength is constantly praiseworthy, whose face is turned towards the desert, who delights in loosing his javelin. Then he spends the rest of the year in Kalhu, and shortly after a new year, he gets a report that Suhu and the neighboring lands have all rebelled. They saw that the Assyrians weren't unbeatable in last year's battle, and as we'll see time and time again, the Assyrian policy of terror will work for them only when they are widely perceived as invincible and cause huge uprisings anytime anyone thinks they have a real chance of getting out from under the Assyrian thumb. The mid-sized Aramaean kings of Laku, Hindanu, and Suhu, all along the Middle Euphrates, have banded together, this time without apparent Babylonian support, and marched to retake the fort of Suru on the Euphrates. Assurnasirpal wasted no time in setting out, taking the direct but harder route straight through the North Mesopotamian stepplands rather than hugging the river networks like he usually would, and reaches Suru before the enemy manages to close it off. From the fort, he readies his logistics, constructing a fleet of goatskin and reed boats, which will occasionally be used for river crossings, but mostly serve as a floating logistics tether back to the stockpiles of Suru as they move forward. His first encounter is probably with a local garrison force of some 500 men. A battle is quickly fought and quickly ended, with 470 of them killed either in the fighting or in subsequent executions, and the remaining 30 captured alive to be impaled on stakes and publicly displayed around the rebellious area. The army then begins aggressively harvesting the rebel wheat, taking some for their own use and sending the rest back via boat to the fortress. Finally, the enemy army arrived, some 6,000 or 7,000 strong, it seems, perhaps twice what the Kassite expedition last year had mustered. So they may have hoped to not just bloody the Assyrians, but actually beat them back. However, this hope would be dashed in a single bloody day of open battle. Somewhere along the banks of the river, two armies met. The course of the battle itself is unknown, but by the end of it, the Assyrian soldiers were positioned with control over the entire river area, causing the Aramaeans to flee in the desert, where some number of them apparently managed to die of thirst before getting to any safe haven. The Middle Euphrates region was close to uncontested at this point, with the grand army of Suhu dispersed and destroyed, and the king began rampaging through the countryside. It wasn't directionless destruction, however. He seems to have specifically targeted the three rebel kings, Azzi-Ili, Illa of the Laku, and Hemti-Ili, all of whom seem to have been significant figures in their own day, and all of whom were caught and either killed or subdued. Azzi-Ili managed to get a few thousand men together, either survivors from the last battle or a new set of troops, but they only managed to slow down the pursuit. Interestingly, it seems that either Assurnasirpal spent a lot of time in the region following the victory over these kings, or it may have been that he simply wandered off from the army while the army was busy on their extensive pursuit and mop-up efforts. Whatever the case, whether the army's still busy or he's just hanging out afterwards, his actions in this time are pretty characteristic. First, he went on a hunting expedition, targeting bulls and ostriches, some of which he killed both for fun and to show off his masculinity, and some of which he captured for his zoo back in Kalhu. Then, either during or after this hunt, he came upon two really good defensive sites, which would help protect the newly reconquered lands from attack from the south and hold control over traffic coming from the upper Euphrates down to Babylonia and back. On these sites, he built two new cities, one named for him, Fort Assurnasirpal, and the other on the other bank of the river he built Nebarti Ashur. I don't know that either town has actually been identified by archaeology, so we can't say much about where they were or how impressive they were, but they would have been both logistical stop-offs, maintaining control of the Middle Euphrates region, as well as important posts for monitoring, controlling, and potentially taxing and restricting trade between the Levant and Babylonia, two places that Assyria does not yet have firm actual control over. Of course, holding the towns of Suhu and neighboring Euphrates countries accomplishes something similar, but founding a whole new town, populating it principally with Assyrians or loyal deportees, and building it in a spot most favorable to the empire will make that river control a bit more durable. After Assurnasirpal settled this region and built these fortress towns, our firm grasp on detailed chronology starts to slip away. Even these last two campaigns have not been assigned year names in the annals. We just sort of assume they happened in the years 878 and 877, since they do seem to follow naturally from what came before. But in fact, there could have been gap years in which the king focused on other, more minor stuff. This is the furthest south that we're going to see the king advance, and the whole thing seems to have been focused on making sure that the resurgent Babylon will not threaten Assyrian power. At some point he also takes, or claims to take, Hirimu and Haratu, fortress towns in northern Babylonia, which are probably closer to the Tigris, and also would have defended against Babylonian incursions just going straight north. But we don't have the accounts of those campaigns, just Assurnasirpal's boast that he controlled these towns at some point during his reign. It is all in service to the ultimate goal we discussed earlier, the march to the Mediterranean, which I kind of thought we'd get to today, but nope, we get to spend another episode with our favorite psycho king, the man who treats real life like a video game, Assurnasirpal II. By closing off that southern front, the main threat to the Assyrian heartland is, presumably, secured against. And we'll see that the Assyrian army can now march west unimpeded. So join us next time for the greatest campaign of Assurnasirpal and the march that will change world history forever. Thank you for listening.